welcome to Games as Lit 101. Today we're actually going to be going into a bit of music theory. I've not talked much about music in video games yet on this show, but there are actually a lot of topics I plan to cover on the subject. I even have a musical episode planned about interactive musicals, but that's such a huge project that I'm actually waiting to take it on until I have a little more support. Go ahead and check out the Patreon link in the description if you want to help make that happen. In any case, lately I've been playing some classic RPGs and visual novels, and there's one concept in particular that's been sticking out to me a lot. Leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are, in short, melodies that are associated with a specific narrative element, like a character, location, or feeling. So for instance, if you're familiar with Sergei Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, a children's story told entirely through music, it's basically composed entirely of leitmotifs, with different melodies to represent each of the individual characters. John Williams uses them a lot in his soundtracks too, like the tune of the Imperial March from Star Wars. Now, video games have a rather unique relationship with leitmotifs, and to understand why and how, we're gonna need to go back closer to the beginning of the medium to see how video game music worked back in the day. Due to both hardware limitations and a tiny amount of space, video games originally had to rely on synthesized music, and could only actually have so much of that music in a given game. Even when it became possible to use real-life audio recordings, few games did so because of the sheer amount of space they took up compared to the relative space efficiency of synthesized tracks. The other important thing to note here is that, due to player involvement, a video game song couldn't be scripted directly to the action like in a film. You don't necessarily know how long the player is going to take in a given area, or exactly when they're going to reach that one pivotal moment or jump scare. So you couldn't really plan the music out moment by moment like you could in film. So instead, video game creators had to paint in broader strokes. These facts set the stage for techniques like looping music, of course, but we're actually going to be talking about something else today. With only so much space on a game cartridge for music, they were gonna have to reuse some assets. So when you have a 10-hour game, there's not actually enough room to have 10 hours of unique background music to back it up. But then repeating the same music over and over for 10 hours would eventually get kind of old and annoying, wouldn't it? Well, it certainly could have, but thankfully for all of us, music is one area in particular in which video games turned their early limitations into strengths. One such way of doing so was the use of leitmotifs. Since a game could only have so many songs, they composed a song for each important element of the game. So in Phoenix Wright, each mood and stage of the trials have their own songs. In Castlevania games, each area of the castle has music that plays throughout it. In basically every Japanese RPG ever made, each character and location has their own theme, along with a few songs to indicate specific moods. Now technically, the term leitmotif is generally used to refer to the recurrence of brief melody lines throughout the course of a soundtrack, even in a variety of different songs in the soundtrack that symbolize a specific narrative element. So we're stretching the definition a tiny bit to use it to refer to entire songs repeated throughout the course of a video game, but there's not really a more accurate musical definition, so we're just gonna go with it. The wonderful thing about this use of leitmotifs is that, aside from allowing our composers to fill our games with music, it also meant that every element of a game had a musical representation that immediately registered with players. Despite these games only having so much space for music, they actually managed to create some really amazing and memorable soundtracks by fusing what few songs they could include to really memorable characters and concepts. I bet any fan of Final Fantasy VII, for instance, could easily recall the person, location, or feeling associated with most of the songs on that soundtrack, and any Mega Man fan can easily recognize the boss themes from the series. To me, this music will always be synonymous with epic battles. This music will always be associated with love, friendship, and crushing loss. And this music will always be associated with happy adventures through space. that last example displayed being a relatively recent game, the awesome thing is that this technique has largely stuck around. I mean, it doesn't have to now, strictly speaking. A lot of video games can and do now have soundtracks more akin to a lot of movie or television soundtracks, where there's enough of music and enough of a variety of music that you never really need to hear the same song twice. But really, most of the best soundtracks in any medium still make decent use of this concept of leitmotifs. Many modern games do still stick to the idea of using leitmotifs as a way to forge an emotional connection between the music and the other elements of a game. Heck, oftentimes, even when a game is being adapted into a film or a television show, these musical concepts and soundtracks are adhered to because they just work so well. And thus, we have a limitation of early game design that actually ended up working in the medium's favor, forging emotional connections between player and game that can never be severed. So, if there are any video game soundtracks that have had this effect on you, go ahead and talk about them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this episode, check out that subscribe button down there. And if you really like what you see with this series, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. That link is also in the description. Next week, we're going to talk about some recent events that highlight just how important it is for us to work on preserving the history of this medium, as well as how difficult it might be to actually do so. So until then, class dismissed.